The main question that I want everyone to think about, especially as you progress from being in school to having co-ops and internships and jobs and all of those things, the question of, do you want better code? And if you want cleaner code, a healthier project, faster velocity, better outcomes, the very first thing that you need to check is not whether you have test coverage or good code review habits or documentation. All of those things are very good and very important. I've written and read a lot about those things, but the most important, the most fundamental thing, the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for important, impactful projects is team culture. Does your team have your back, or are your teammates going to stab you and sabotage you when you aren't looking? The good technical outcomes that we all want, the happy work environments, the healthy code bases, the impactful projects, these are all downstream results from the culture that we build and the relationships that we maintain. I've said many times that all wisdom in tech is either aphorism or personal story. So I'm going to warm up with aphorisms. It's been said for almost 50 years, software engineering is the multi-person development of multi-version programs. And a lot of my talks, I poke at the multi-version parts of that. A lot of my talks have a theme of, oh, hey, time is the hard part. This one is going to be much more about the multi-person part of that, teamwork, communication. One of my coworkers, Russ Cox, who is basically in charge of the Go programming language, says software engineering is what happens to programming when you add time and other programmers. An old anonymous quote, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. An internal discussion that is cited a lot at Google is healthy debate and disagreement work best in an environment where there is support and respect for people, where the ideas, not the individuals, are stress tested. It is okay to disagree with someone's point. It is not okay to consider them a worse person for having tried to make that point. The great business wisdom quote generator that is Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. A leader at Google says, software engineering is a team sport. And I'm going to let all of these quotes sort of rattle around in your head for a little bit. This sort of sets the tone a bit. And I want us to move on to visualization. And so we're going to walk through some memories here. And for those of you still in school, these might be fairly recent memories. Remember learning to program? When we learn to program, just like when you learn to read, it's a very individual activity. You might be in a group when you're learning it, but you're learning an individual skill, one that modifies your cognition. As you go from being a child to being literate and learning to read, you're restructuring the way that your brain processes things. You become much more linear, much more causal. And as you learn to program, you become much more algorithmic. It changes the way that you think about problems. And that is inherently a personal and very individual thing. And this is true regardless of where and how you learn, if you taught yourself or if you learned at university. Remember lectures. Think back to the classes where you were being shown a programming language or introduced to programming. If you're like me, or the, say, 2/3 of people responding to a Twitter poll that I ran recently, very scientific, most, if not all, of your lessons in how to program were transmitted through slides or books. And as someone that gives a lot of conference talks and the like, let me tell you that code that fits on a slide is a very, very different thing than real code. Very little of our learning actually involves watching an experienced programmer write out some code, fight with a compiler, spin up a debugger, and all of those things. And all of this means that it is not at all unlikely for a graduate from a Western university with a CS degree to have not actually witnessed someone performing this creative act that they are now being certified in. Imagine if this was how we tried to teach art or music. Hey, learn this skill, but we're never going to show it to you. We're only going to show you the results of it. Think back to your assignments. Not all, but certainly most programmers that wind up at top-tier jobs are coming out of a university program. One of the effects of that is that their learning is coupled with a need for assessment. It isn't enough for you to learn it. You have to learn it in a way that your instructors can prove that you learned it so that they can give you a grade. I spent a few years in academia, and when I started focusing on education internally at Google, it took me a while to realize how much that need to assess, that need to provide a grade, actually constrains curriculum and pedagogy. It's a really interesting and weird thing. One of the side effects of this need for assessment is that assignments are much easier when they're structured as individual activities. Right? Profs and lecturers are going to go to great lengths to ensure that everyone has the same assignment, and we're usually very clear about those rules. You can discuss overall strategy, but you can't share code. Maybe you can help each other debug, but in a lot of cases, you're explicitly told collaborating on code is cheating. Keep your code to yourself. And then you have the assessment part of your assignments. Some prof or anonymous grader is going to go through your code and literally judge you, to assign a score to you for the thing that you have toiled away at for the past couple weeks. And I think when you put these memories together, it's pretty reasonable to come to the conclusion that the emotional connection that we've all been given as the result of this style of learning might not be the one we want. I think we've been taught that code is shame. Your code is shameful and secretive and not to be shared and not to be seen in public. We get this image of a lone coder in a dark room late at night with no one around. You sit there hunched over the keyboard, typing away furiously. And if you're the sort of genius that you secretly hope you are, you create something magically wonderful, and it's not witnessed by anyone. After all, why would anyone have seen it? Why would you have shared it? You've never seen an expert share code or create code, and you've been told not to do so. For years of your training up until the point that you enter the industry, everything has been suggested to you as do it yourself in private and avoid sharing anything. Whole generations of programmers have been built around this model, whether intentional or otherwise. But the problem with this is that programming is not software engineering. Remember all of those quotes. We have to learn one before the other, and programming is certainly a component of software engineering, but they are different, they are distinct. Software engineering, the job that everyone at Google has, for instance, is a team effort. And I think that demonstrates the stakes in all of this, right? Being successful as a software engineer requires being a good teammate, but we're usually only trained in and only interviewed in how to be a good programmer. All too often, we aren't even told that the actual job is not programming. The actual job is software engineering. So what does it take to be a good teammate? A lot of the research and guidance that I'm going to give here in this talk come from two Googlers. Well, one is now a former Googler, Ben and Fitz. They wrote about this in their book, Team Geek, almost 10 years ago, I guess. And also in the teamwork and leadership chapters of the Software Engineering at Google book that I published last year. Their major advice for being a good team member is to focus on 3 pillars that underpin most good relationships: humility, respect, and trust. Humility is the idea that you are not omniscient. You are not infallible. You make mistakes and you can admit that. You're open to self-improvement, to learning and criticism. If you don't have humility, it's going to be difficult for you to work on a team. Respect is the idea that you care about others that you work with. You treat them kindly and you appreciate their abilities and their accomplishments. You support them. And trust is the idea that you believe that those other people on your team are competent and will do the right thing, and you're okay with taking your hands off the wheel and letting them drive when it is appropriate to do so. The idea here is that if you perform a root cause analysis on almost any social conflict, you will ultimately trace it back to a lack of humility, respect, and/or trust. Culture eats strategy. Culture eats tech. Culture eats impact. Culture eats success. If you have a bad or even just mediocre team culture, one where it is common to be lacking humility and respect and trust, then over a period of a couple years, I will guarantee that your team is going to slow down, lose impact, communicate less and less well, and is going to produce worse results, worse code, worse systems. So let's go back to visualization and see how this plays out. Imagine 2 teams are working on similar projects. It's Google, so they're probably messaging apps. Let's admit it. One of these is a place where people exhibit humility, Team FAR, and one where people are much more sure of themselves and the rightness of their ideas, Team FAST. So some VP above both of these teams put out a call for proposals to build the next generation system. So we're going to need a proposal and some design docs, and which team is going to put together a better pitch on average. Team FAR finds someone on the team to take a crack at it, let's say Alice. Because Alice has trust in her teammates, she posts a draft of what she's thinking early, and the rest of Team FAR comments on it. Because Alice exhibits humility, her teammates are comfortable making suggestions that she might disagree with, and make comments that seek to clarify and enhance the proposal. Did you consider X? Can we also do Y? What do you think about Z? Even if they disagree on the merit of the suggestion, they can do so respectfully. I think we should change focus here. Maybe do more A than B. Could be followed up by, no, I think B is still more important, and here's why. And if you don't actually disagree, or if you don't actually come to agreement in, review comments, in doc comments, or over email, then you can say, maybe we should discuss in person or over video chat. In the end, the team spends quite a bit of time on the proposal, not just Alice, but all of her reviewers as well. But the end result incorporates Alice's thinking, as well as ideas from other members of the team. Even the ideas that started as Alice's are now understood by the team, and in places where Alice's ideas were good, the document was still improved by clarifying it and improving the reasoning so that it's easier to absorb for people that aren't the original author. That is, after all, the perspective that the VP in this story is going to have. They're aware of the problem, but not all of the details. By comparison, Team FAST puts someone else in charge of their proposal. If they're anything like the average low humility, respect, trust team, it's probably their TL Fred that gets to write the proposal. Fred looks like a little bit of the evil version of Titus. Because Fred doesn't feel like he has the trust of the team, he works on it in secret until he's completely satisfied. Because Fred lacks humility, once he shares it with the team, he takes every comment as a personal attack. Because the team has gone through this before, most people on the team don't bother to comment. Suggesting that Fred could do better just leads to fights. So in the end, Fred feels triumphant. He put together a proposal and nobody on the team could, from his perspective, poke any holes in it. So it's clearly the right path. That doesn't make it the better proposal. Which of these proposals do you think is most likely to actually be funded? And this exact same reasoning applies to all sorts of communication-driven engineering tasks, which is a lot of them. Who do you want to do code reviews with, Alice or Fred? Who do you want to have your regular one-on-one meetings with? Who do you want peer reviews from? Who do you want to be your team lead or your manager? Which team do you think is more likely to be able to provide constructive criticism and feedback on how a team member could improve? When there's an outage or a deadline and tensions are high, which team is going to communicate better? And which one is running the risk of having a blow up and an argument that leaves people angry and mistrustful? I'm not remotely done with this exercise. On Team FAST, members of the team lack trust, and they're much more prone to feeling judged, whether accurately or not, by the rest of the team for their mistakes or for not moving fast enough. Code review is perfunctory. No one is willing to ask questions because admitting that they don't understand a piece of code is risky. And anything but the most obvious bug is going to get some pushback. Right? If you make a suggestion and your teammate is taking that as an attack, it's not going to go well. So instead of the team collectively agreeing to accept changes, most code is basically written by one person and rubber stamped. That is not getting the full value out of code review. Also, now the team is dependent on that person can't leave the team, otherwise we don't understand how this code works. That's not a healthy long-term system. By comparison, on Team FAR, people know that they aren't going to be judged for making suggestions or asking questions. In code review, it's easier to look at a tricky piece of code and say, hey, I don't entirely understand this. Can you explain it to me? And then presumably either it gets refactored for clarity, or at least comments are added if there isn't a better way to write that. It's easier to admit that your change is missing some test coverage, rather than feeling that you have to fight back when someone suggests adding something. It's easier to say, hey, I'm going to work on our flaky tests for this next sprint, without feeling that the rest of the team is judging you and thinks that you're just slacking off. Tests will be better. Code review can ensure both quality and understanding. Code review will ensure that people are learning on both sides of that review. Both reviewers and reviewees will learn more from that process when there is humility and respect and trust. So let me be completely explicit here. Team Fast is going to have worse code. Tests are going to be worse, less clear, more brittle, more flaky, less capable of actually catching bugs and providing the normal value of tests. Code health is going to dwindle. Programming is hard, y'all, and 2 sets of eyes are always going to be better than 1. I've done code reviews for people that are clearly in the top 100 best software engineers of all time, and 2 sets of eyes are still better, even if one of those sets of eyes is a Turing Award winner. Because people feel judged and pressured to move fast, we're all going to fall back on our initial training, those university experiences that say we all need to work individually and that code is to be hidden and treated as shameful unless it is perfect. They're going to focus on features and other easy measures of impact rather than relying on the support of their team to actually do things right. So what can we do to be more like Team Far than like Team Fast? Research conducted internally at Google almost 15 years now talks about successful teams being the places where this sort of supportive culture exists, where we have good psychological safety. This is sort of a more general term that I think encompasses humility and respect and trust. We broadly define this as the state where team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. Something that certainly seems to match what I would expect for a team with good humility, respect, and trust. I think it's casually okay to talk about the 2 properties interchangeably, but to be clear that psychological safety is made up of each of these 3 sort of lower level properties, and you or your teammates may need to work on shoring up different aspects of that to get to a place of safety. So how do you change team culture to build up an environment of that safety? Well, I think that's easy. Obviously, you just get your manager to say, everyone needs to feel safe now, and the problem is solved. This talk is over and we can move to Q&A. I'm joking. More seriously, we need to look at what goes into safety. So we look at how do you foster humility and respect and trust. Humility, I think, has a lot of factors to it, but the 3 that might be most important are start with losing the ego, right? You don't have to be the one that is right. And in fact, if you get out of the phrasing of I need to be right and move to a world where the team needs to be right, then you and the team are going to grow much more rapidly. You need to learn to take criticism, and that's hard, especially because we are not well trained in that, and it's very, very easy to get wrapped up in the things that you have spent so long on. I know that I have room to improve on this just as much as anyone else, but the point is that you have to try, and you need to learn from your mistakes. And that is sort of central in a lot of modern thinking about how successful tech works. Right? We talk about blame-free postmortems. A good mistake is not a problem. A good mistake is a learning opportunity. The goal of any team, the goal of any engineer is not never make a mistake. That means that you're just not aiming for anything interesting. The goal is don't make the same mistake twice, right? And that's an important change. All of this goes into building humility, and this is all especially important for leaders. The tech leads, the team leads, the managers, senior engineers, people higher up the chain, people that have been there a little bit. The junior engineers on your team are going to look up to you, and they're going to tend to, consciously or unconsciously, follow the behavior that you put forth. If you admit your mistakes, if you allow others to be right, if you admit you don't know things, you show that you're open to criticism, then you're going to make a lot of space for the others in your team to follow in your footsteps. And that's critical. It's also important to point out that when we're looking at building respect, it isn't just I respect you that matters when we're talking about psychological safety. It's also I feel respected by you. Respect is a relationship. Both sides need to be involved, need to be active participants. Once we see respect as a matter of communicating and demonstrating that, I think it's actually kind of an easier manner. Many of us have been trained since childhood on how to act respectfully. We say please, and importantly, we say thank you. What we're looking for here is gratitude. Give thanks, give praise, call out good work where you see it. Years ago on social media, someone suggested a thing to add to team meeting rituals. And one part of the ritual is kudos, an open forum for people to informally point out things that other people on the team have done that was a success, where they went above and beyond, etc. And this works really well for two reasons. By publicly praising others, you're showing that you respect them, that you appreciate their efforts. But it's also good for you directly, because it turns out there's extensive research on this these days. Practicing gratitude is good for you. Being conscious of what you are thankful for is a quick way to shift your focus away from the constant stream of anxieties and negative emotions and towards a focus on the positive. Even doing that only a few minutes a week has been shown to help. And interestingly, once you set a precedent for gratitude, it spreads. At Google, we have a program for peer bonuses. It's been around since the early days of Google. And you can go to an internal website and say, hey, this other engineer did a good thing for me. You can write up, I think, 200, 300 words describing what they did. You click a button, and unless their manager specifically says, no, that's no good, they will get like a $200 bonus on their next paycheck, right? It's a nice thing. I made a conscious decision to foster the gratitude ritual in our team meetings, just the informal bits, just saying thanks. And almost immediately, it bloomed into not only that ritual during team meetings, but peer bonuses within the team and outside the team. As a result, people in my 35-person organization are now involved in a bonus, either giving or receiving, about once a day on average. Over the rest of my decade at Google, I've never seen anything like that. We might have seen one bonus every 6 months. And I think the peer bonus program is honestly one of Google's best and most underutilized cultural traditions. For a few $100, Google gets one engineer to spend a few minutes on gratitude, which is good for them, and another Googler gets a tangible reminder that their work is valued. And depending on what mailing lists are CC'd, this may all play out fairly publicly. It's a really nice, happy moment. And in fact, I'd argue that the way that most teams react to this sort of thing is maybe a leading indicator on how you're doing on gratitude, right? If everyone on the team is amazed at the incredible work that goes into earning $100, they're not sending enough bonuses. Remember, the bonuses are approved by a manager. It's their job to say this isn't worthy or they already got a bonus for this, right? And so it shouldn't be so rare. That's kind of the point. And finally, but maybe most importantly, how do you build a culture of trust on a team and within an organization? What does that even really mean? And I think one way to look at it is to answer the question, will it be okay if I make a mistake? Will it be okay to not know something? Trust is a major pillar in psychological safety. And my suggestion for building trust is not doing trust fall exercises, especially not during work from home, because I don't think that those work over Zoom. Rather, I think the answer is a mix of how we build respect and how we build humility. Starting with the leaders, we admit our mistakes. And to that end, most of my teams now follow the kudos exercise in our weekly meeting with an exercise we call the monkey. Anyone that wants to can say, I might deserve the monkey this week. I made the biggest mistake. And then they get to tell the story of their big mistake. Leaders are strongly encouraged to self-nominate, to set a clear example, and to demonstrate that perfection is not required. This is terrifying and awkward at first. Initially, we found it easier when we made it a little bit formal. I had these stuffed monkeys made up that with custom printing that just says whoops on it. Whoever we decided collectively did indeed make the biggest mistake of the week gets this adorable stuffed monkey to sit on their desk until the next meeting. This picture is one of my teammates, Mark, who had this user pick for a while. He leads a lot of the massive refactoring projects, large-scale changes, as we describe it in the Flamingo book. And so according to him, most random Googlers that are meeting him for the first time are doing so because he broke their code somehow. And so he may as well be upfront about the fact that he sometimes makes mistakes, but he will also learn from them. To be clear, Mark makes very few mistakes. And to be extra clear, even if he made more mistakes, it would still be okay. I care, like I said, far more about not repeating unnecessary mistakes. And most of the things that someone like Mark actually breaks are not so much a mistake as, well, your system was ill configured and someone on your team did something very weird and your tests didn't run, and I'm sorry, and we'll fix it. That's not so bad. The point of the monkey exercise is very specific. The team is going to do better if mistakes are made public so that we can learn from them and avoid them in the future. And we can simultaneously demonstrate that we aren't aiming for perfection. We're aiming for progress. We're aiming for improvement. Admitting your mistakes in public and having concrete proof that it's okay is a very powerful way to build trust. When you open yourself up and make yourself vulnerable, all of our dark fears and worries say, oh, your teammates are going to think you're an idiot and they're going to go in for the kill. But in practice, good teams are smarter than that. They see all of the flaws in the system that made that mistake possible. They see the wild set of connections that would have been necessary to spot that mistake from a distance. They see the vulnerability that you present as a human, and they move to embrace you rather than pouncing on your weakness. There's tons of public research on all of this, from management practices and team development, psychology, cognitive science. I encourage all of you to spend a little time studying up on gratitude and team dynamics and psychological safety and blame-free postmortems, which are very much a part of all of this. For a deeper dive, try going back a ways to Team Geek, which is a very nice little book, or read the culture chapters from the software engineering book, which is now available for free. You can Google it. The PDF is available online. In the end, culture is at the root of success. In tech and with most things, I argue. Our internal research has now shown this for more than a decade. The major successful indicator for good teams is not a technical decision, nor a matter of team makeup, nor a matter of find one perfect, magically powerful, brilliant engineer to lead this thing. It's not that. It's a matter of team culture. Software engineering is a team sport, and nobody wants to be on a team with a bunch of jerks. We need team spirit. We need to have each other's backs. If you find yourself on a team that does this well, you will find a team that thrives, that solves impossible problems, that blows away everyone else in terms of impact and growth. If it was a simple matter of programming, then your base skill as a programmer, your ability to jockey your IDE, your knowledge of programming languages and trivia would be all that actually matters. But real tech problems, Google problems, are not programming problems. They are software engineering problems. We must rely on a team. We must plan to go far and go together. And thus it turns out that it is just as important to be a good person, to be a good teammate, as it is to be a good programmer. And so I encourage all of you to spend some time thinking about your behavior, your approach, your communication style, oh my Lord, and think about what you can do to improve humility, respect, and trust. Psychological safety underpins all good teams. And in the long term, that is going to have a deep impact on their ability to be successful, both in long-term outcomes as well as just internal issues inside the team. A healthy team culture builds the foundations needed for a healthier code base, builds the foundations needed for successful projects and success in tech. And we'll go to Q&A.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Titus. Yeah, a lot of us get so wrapped up in technical skills that we forget to pay attention to like focusing on being a good teammate. So I think a lot of us took something useful away from this presentation.
I hope
so. Now, yeah, let's do some Q&A. So the way this will work is first we'll take audience questions, and then we'll ask questions from the Slido if time permits.
Sounds good.
Yes. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand on Zoom and we'll make sure to ask you to unmute, and then you can ask those. Or feel free to drop a question in the Slido as well, which I'll link.
Okay, we have a question from Frank. Okay.
Hello?
Hey.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi. So you mentioned stuff about like being like the monkey culture where you have those sessions where you can just be vulnerable and sort of just talk about some of the mistakes. And I feel like inherently that's just a very difficult thing to do. To, at least I think personally, my experience, just having the courage to just admit to mistakes. I mean, for smaller mistakes, it's easier to do, but I'd imagine like the bigger the mistake is, or the bigger the consequences from the mistake is, the harder it is to sort of admit to it. And like, I feel like there's this sort of fine line where each person has, where like they feel comfortable with sharing it, and then they don't feel comfortable sharing it. So I guess my question is like, should this kind of line exist, or should it kind of just be like, well, let's just crank it all the way up. We'll admit to each and every mistake that we've ever had in our life.
Right. I think that's a very good question, and I won't claim that. Oh, just do this one thing starting this week, and everything will be sunshine and ponies. Like, it takes work. Like I said, the first probably month of trying to get that to stick felt a little awkward and scary, and I had to pretty explicitly like seed those discussions with stuff that I botched, and talk to people that I knew had screwed something up during the week, and like prepare them for like, hey, I think it's actually going to be important for you to like describe what went into that. Because as it turns out, like I said, programming really hard, y'all, right? Like, it is perfectly understandable, especially when you're operating at like a high level, for there to be things that you missed, right? That's just human nature, right? Like, everything in software is going to be just on the ragged edge of how complicated we can manage, right? Because everything that's easier than that, we've already automated or solved. And everything that's harder than that, we can't do, right? So it's inherent in software that you're always going to be right on the edge of failing, right? And so we have to constantly be fighting against the human like shame nature of self-preservation and like, yeah, I screwed this up and I'm not going to talk about it. And so finding whatever ways you can to ratchet up the level of trust so that people are okay with that. Because in the end, yeah, like, it's hard. Like, programming is hard, doing things on a team is hard, working in shared code base is hard. Even if you only have 5 people and 10,000 lines of code, like, there's plenty of things that are tricky that you're modestly likely to screw up over time. When you work at a place like Google, I've got 250 million lines of code and 12,000 engineers working in my code base. Like, it's impossible to know everything. Yeah, like, sometimes things are going to get botched. The sooner that we get over that fear of like, or that the sooner that we recognize, yeah, mistakes are going to happen. Try not to make the same one twice. Try to build systems to prevent the scary ones. That's the goal. But it's hard. And, in the end, software engineering is programming with more people and more time. And we focus a lot on training ourselves to deal with the programming parts. We need to focus some amount of time on training ourselves to deal with the people parts. It's just as important as the programming.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Good insight. Really good insight.
All right. Now we got a question from Gordon.
Hey, Titus. First, just thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed like all the insights that you provided. And I was curious to know, you mentioned having like this culture of gratitude and this culture of, really trusting in your team and really like how that can make the team much more productive and useful. How would you go about, I guess, creating such an environment, right? Like with the Google, I forget what the program was called, but it was like
peer bonuses.
Peer bonuses. It's like you give like an anonymous kudo almost, and then they get a bonus from that, right? So if it was
anonymous.
But yeah, if it was like in a smaller setting, like how would you go about like introducing this into a system?
I mean, I don't think it has to be monetary. I think even just the normal bits of, hey, I was stumped on this thing and I went and I talked to Sue and she fixed it. Turns out I was just, glossing over, I'd been staring at this thing for too long and I missed it piece. I sat on the C++ standards committee for many years now. I was listening to some of my standards committee friends on Twitter, and someone posted like, I can't figure out why this code doesn't work. And it was an if statement formatted to look like a for loop. And that was impossible. Like, we all stared at it for 10 minutes, right? Like, and so like, as soon as someone actually spotted it, we're like, oh, yes, of course, right? And like these sorts of things are going to happen all the time. All that we're really looking for is when someone helps you out, like thank them, but more importantly, thank them in public, like so that the team can see it, right? Because the more that you do that, the more that you normalize the act of being a decent person, the less scary it is for people to be a decent person, right? Like, just make it normal. That's most of what it takes. It doesn't have to be anything more than that.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Sri. Oh, one sec.
Muted.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Hey, Titus, thanks for the great talk. I just had a question. So you mentioned some neat techniques to encourage like respect and trust in teams. So I was just wondering, what has Google done to help teams lose the ego and build humility?
I think to some extent you get that just by showing up at Google. It is pretty common to hear people at Google talk about imposter syndrome, where you look at what everyone else around you is doing, you're like, I have no idea how to do that job. I clearly don't belong here. I can't. I hope they don't find out. And once you realize that literally everyone else is feeling exactly the same way, it is a little easier to realize, like, okay, I'm not the biggest fish in the pond. Like, there are things for me to learn. It's okay. That sort of helps. I think any situation that you can get in where you're not the biggest fish in the pond anymore will have a natural tendency to push you towards that. And then beyond that, I think it's really just a matter of putting a little energy into it. Like we're all modestly self-aware humans. Like realizing like, oh yeah, I should pay attention to this still goes a long way. It doesn't have to be super complicated.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Yep.
Any more audience questions? Otherwise, we'll move on to the Slido. Okay. Nim has a question.
Hey, Titus. Yeah, thanks again for the talk. So, I mean, you talked, I guess, a lot about Google, and I guess one thing that's unique, or not unique, but at sort of like these bigger companies, it's, more like this sort of like well-oiled machine where, you potentially like have, or at least to a certain extent that have sort of a lot of these standards laid out. So when you like, bring that back to, like smaller companies where you have, or even startups where you have sort of that culture of like, move fast and sort of break things, how important is it to encourage, I guess, this idea of, blameless postmortems, but more on top of that, how would you, I guess, transfer some of that into those, smaller cultures where, I guess, the expectation is that you're sort of, breaking things and that you're sort of, moving fast, I guess. So like where you may not have, as much time as, per se at some of these like larger companies where, projects can tend to take, I guess, longer, I guess.
Yeah. Is that a question of just in general, how do you shift that mindset? Or is that a question of, is good team culture incompatible with startup?
Yeah, I would say like, yeah, I guess one is, yeah, like shifting the mindset, but I guess more also on top of that is like, how important is it, right? Like, I guess in these, like when you have, I guess, smaller cultures and where you sort of see these issues like, happening like more often, like, is there anything that's different that you guys just sort of consider?
Right. So as far as the first part of that, just the tech and engineering bits, one of the ideas that I bring up a lot in other sorts of talks is the idea of what's the expected lifespan of the code that you're working on, right? Because there's 6 orders of magnitude of reasonable answer to this question, right? You could be writing something that's going to be thrown away in 30 seconds, or you could be writing something that has an expected lifespan of decades, effectively unknown, unbounded. And it's patently ridiculous to me I imagine that the best practices are the same on both ends of that spectrum. Like, that's clearly not the case. If I'm sitting down to write a little script to, parse some logs or something, right? I'm going to write 50 lines of code and run it once and throw it away. I'm going to skip testing and code review and a bunch of the other things that like we all know are best practices because they kind of just doesn't matter that much, right? So there's a spectrum in there. And one of the major differences between working at a place like Google and working in a much smaller startup is you shouldn't be planning for the super long term. You should be planning for the medium long term because it's gonna matter. But like there's the change in like what the right answer is, right? Context matters. And when you're at a place like Google, like mistakes can be very costly, right? A terrible privacy incident could be, the EU sues you now. Nobody wants that. Whereas there was a story I was hearing just recently, and I forget what startup they were talking about. It might have been like Snapchat or something. But and the question was, what is your plan for user backups? What is your plan for these sorts of incidents? And the answer was very honest. It was, we would like to get acquired. We don't actually have a plan for that, but as soon as there's money, then we'll figure that out. Right? And like, I can't say that that's inherently the wrong answer. Right? Most startups are just going to fail in a couple years. Like, don't invest in things that probably won't happen for 10 years. As far as the cultural bits, I don't think that any of this is incompatible at all, right? Like the move fast and break things is fine, but you need to be mindful of what you're trying to break. And a lot of the basics of like engineering, software best practices, testing, code review, all of those things, those still pay off in a couple weeks, right? So unless you're running a startup and your funding round comes at the end of the weekend, you probably still need to act like an adult and be professional and all of those things. And as soon as you start getting into scenarios where it's, oh yeah, we're gonna have some code review. Oh yeah, we're gonna like make sure everyone knows what other people are working on. Then it's team sport already, and like, you kind of want people to actually be nice. I see no actual value in a culture that is aggressively aggressive. You're going to get a whole lot farther when people are supportive.
Yeah, no, I think that totally the stuff you said makes sense. Yeah, thanks so much for that answer.
Yeah. Good question.
Okay, next is Bruce.
Thank you for your talk, Titus. I have two questions. One is, so when you were trying to introduce these changes, or if when other people are trying to introduce changes, do they ever meet any sort of like resistance to that, and how do they overcome that? And my second question is, I think another symptom of a lack of trust is sometimes when you do you do like a collaborative project, you want to try to sort of micromanage or like keep yourself involved in all aspects of it. And I was wondering if you had any other particular strategies for preventing that sort of thing.
Right. So as to, does it fail? Like, yeah, like anything else, that's hard, sometimes it fails. There have certainly been quite a few swings that I have attempted in making, changes in how we approach cultural things. I remember there was a point where I was trying to add like just a minute of mindfulness as like one facet of our team meetings. Like, we're just going to start with 1 minute of quiet. Like, spend a minute before we have all of this discussion to think about like where you are, focus on your breathing, what are you doing? And we tried it twice. I think we tried it twice, and it just felt so weird. Nobody voted to keep it, like, and I could not come up with a way to like ease it in and make it normal. But some of that was I didn't believe in it strong enough or pitch it hard enough, like, and some of it was it just wasn't the right fit for the team. Like, every team is going to be a little bit different. What I have described here works for mine. It may or may not work for yours, but the underlying goals of humility and respect and trust are, I think, universal. Your second question was, now I lost it. What was your second question? Oh, micromanaging.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. The host didn't unmute my time.
No problem. Yeah, when you're working in a collaborative thing, especially if it's like your first time leading a group or running a project, the temptation is very strong for, I'm going to micromanage this. I want to control everything. I want to look at, do all of the design reviews. You send all of your code to me for review. Like, I'll show you exactly how to do it. And that can be a problem, for sure. One of the biggest, most important pieces of advice that I got was, when you are working with other people, you need to be very clear on, is the goal I'm delegating, or is the goal you are just my puppet? And those are different, right? If you are just my puppet, they have no agency, they have no authority in any of these things, right? They're just trying to push the buttons that you ask them to when you tell them to. When you delegate, you get less control over it. And a comparison that I make is, think about writing. If you are copy editing someone's essay or a journal article or something like that, the things that you're going to point out are places where the sentence structure is screwy, or the point is unclear, or grammar problems, spelling errors, all of those sorts of things. And that's important. What you're not trying to do is to make it read exactly as if you wrote it, right? Like, the original author's voice needs to be present. And the same thing sort of applies in code review and design review and those sorts of things, right? Like, the original authorial voice still can be present. All that you really need to do is make sure that the things that everyone has collectively agreed on, style guides and language choices and like the big picture design, like, you've met those goals. I don't actually care about like the internal details, right? And so if you look at real good, like high quality guidance on, say, code review, a lot of those things will focus on be very clear about the difference between this is a law, you must do this, versus here's a citation for a best practice, versus here's my opinion, what do you think? Or here's a question, what do you think? And so long as you're not just trying to rewrite it as if you did it yourself, you'll do okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's sometimes a big temptation. I think it's very important.
It is. The other part of that I think is important to remember is just like in game theory, like there's a difference between playing Prisoner's Dilemma once versus iterated Prisoner's Dilemma. Like the strategy is actually different. And a lot of the early guidance in tech was very much built around the idea that you're going to form a team and solve one problem. That's not actually how it works, right? Instead, you're going to form a team, you're going to solve this problem, then you're going to move on to the next one, and some team members are going to come and go, and but it's more of an iterated thing. And the difference in strategy there is really night and day, right? If you're forming a team to do one thing, then you put your best person on every task, right? And everything else is support for them. Like you see this in the Mythical Man Month essays about the surgeon team. That all seems kind of nonsense in the modern era because it's just not how things actually work. Instead, what you probably want is not the best person does this, it's the most junior person that has the skills to probably do it with some supervision should do it. Because then it gets done, it takes maybe a little longer, but they grow. And that's important because next time you'll be able to do a bigger project, right?
Yeah, the best person's not going to be there forever. So yeah.
Right. And if you can build up more people to take the place of the best person, they can move on to solve a new impossible thing, right? This is how it's actually supposed to work. This is why, certain organizations within Google are very successful. Like they figure out how to make that machine just work.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so Titus, it looks like we're actually almost out of time, but are you down to answer a few more questions and go a little over time?
I'd give you 5 minutes, yeah.
Sure, okay. We actually have one question that's very highly voted in our Slido. And it's this one. How do you change a team's culture if they're already rooted in team fast values? What changes need to happen?
I think it has to start with leadership to some extent. Like you have to set an example of what the norms you actually want to foster. And it's not quick. It's not a night and day thing, especially if patterns are already established. These sorts of things take 6 months, a year maybe. But it is also surprisingly important to take care of it like early and aggressively, like put some energy into it. Because even small differences, even small failings on these points can make a big difference. There's a internal mailing list that I sort of, I'm not moderating it per se, but like it's sort of the community that I lead. And there's like 1,000 people, 2,000 people on there, and 20 or 30 that are very regular posters. And what we found most of 10 years ago was it was kind of just toxic, right? People would ask a question about like, hey, I'm confused about this C++ feature. And responses would not be, oh, let me explain it to you. It would be, how can you possibly not know that, right? And that's not helpful, right? That makes people afraid to admit that they don't know things. And what we eventually found was even just 1 or 2 people that had a slightly off, like not that aggressive, but like slightly rude or abrasive tone could be enough to change the mood for that whole group of, 1,000 people, right? And so even just small tweaks to how you operate, of someone with some authority says, hey, you should be more polite as a response to those messages. Like, hey, that could be read kind of rough. Maybe you meant it this way. But if you publicly and visibly stand up for being a good person, that changes. And I started aggressively trying to adjust that tone, and it took 6 months. But now it is a place where actually we have really good discussions on some deep topics, and the newcomers are very willing to ask questions, and we have a whole lot more traffic, and the level of discourse has gone way up because people aren't fighting to be the one that got the last word. They are, hey, that is an interesting question. Let's dig into it and learn. And that's really what you have to aim for.
All right, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so now we're slightly over time, so we're gonna wrap up the event. Thanks everyone for coming out.
Yeah, but most of all, thank you so much, Titus, for taking the time out of your day to give us this talk. I'm sure all of us here have learned something new from this. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.